Welcome back to MonsterTamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, for our cutscene and endgame events feature, we worked on updating our map data in Tiled to have a new events object. If you missed the previous videos, there will be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There will also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. Now that we've updated our project to use our new JSON file from Tiled, we now need to update our game to parse our new object layer, and then create our zones for our events in our game. To do this, let's jump into our world scene, and let's come up to the top of our class. The first thing we'll do is we'll create a new property for Tiled to keep track of which properties should be available from our objects. So let's copy this here, go ahead and paste it. Let's update our name to be Tiled, and we'll say event property. On our event data from Tiled, the only thing we have right now is just our ID, so let's change this to ID. And so next, we now need to parse our map data from Tiled and grab that object layer. To do this, we'll add a brand new method. So let's come down to the bottom of our class. Let's add in a brand new method. We'll have a private method. We'll call this create event encounter zones. And we'll expect one argument, and this will be our tiled map. Then real quick, I'm going to go to our create items method. I'm going to copy our JS doc types here, and we'll expect the same thing down in this method here. And so we're going to do logic very similar to our create items method here, where first we need to grab our object layer, so events, and then for each object that exists on that layer, we want to filter them down to make sure it's a valid event, so we at least have a X and Y position. From there, we need to loop through those objects, and then we need to create something in our Phaser game to represent that object. And so for our items, we actually create sprites to represent these items in our game. For our event zones, we don't need anything visually in our game. Instead, we just need to create this area where when the player overlaps with it, we can check for that overlap and then do something in our code. And so we will add some debugging functionality so we can see our event zones, but by default, we don't want these actually visible in our end game. And to do this, we can use a special type of game object in Phaser called a zone. And a zone is a game object that is not rendered out into our scene, but it allows us to check for overlaps, collisions, and much more. And it also has a lot of the default properties that other game objects would have. And so we can specify like width, height, and different things like that. So to do all this, let's copy our logic from inside our create items method. Let's come down to our new method. We'll paste that in. And let's update some of our variable names here. So instead of item object layer, we're going to do event object layer. For our object layer we want to grab events. And let's update our references. So instead of items, we're going to have events, and then we'll have valid events. And when we're looping through here, let's do event, and now let's update our references. All right, so we won't need an item ID. Let's get rid of this code here. All we're going to care about is going to be the ID on our object. So we'll change this to be tiled event properties, and we're going to do tiled event property, and we want to grab our ID, and we'll grab the value from there. So instead of creating our item, let's remove this logic here. And then so here, this is where we'll create our event zones. And so before we do that, let's come back up to our code where we have items picked up. And for this, anytime we pick up an item in our game, we store a record of that in our data manager. So then that way, when we recreate our level, for any items we've already picked up, we won't recreate them in our game. We want to do a similar thing for our events, and so on our data manager, we're going to want to store which events we've already seen in our game, and then that way when we reload our level or when we transition between our buildings and our world, we don't recreate these event zones if we've already viewed them. And so since we don't have this on our data manager yet, let's just replace this with a hard-coded array, and we'll say viewed events, and we'll change this to be a string. And down here, we'll do viewed events. And then for our type here, we'll change this to be string. And then finally, I'm just going to add a to-do. So we come back and address this. We'll do to-do. We'll say update this to pull data from data manager. So now for our zone game objects, we can do this. We'll do add, and we'll do zone. And so for our zone game object, this is very similar to like when we create a rectangle. And so we need to provide our positioning and then the width and the height that we like our game object to be. For this, we need to reference our tiled item. So we'll do tiled event. We want to grab our X value, our tiled event. We'll do our Y value. We'll do minus our tile size. We're going to multiply that by 2. And so this is just by default of where the origin of our game object gets positioned in tiled versus Phaser. We need to account for our Y value so we position it correctly. Next, we'll want to grab our width, and then we'll grab our height. Let's update our origin, our game object, to be in the top left-hand corner. So set it to 0. And then let's add a name to it. We'll do set name. And then we need to do our ID. Real quick, instead of doing ID, I'm going to change this to be event ID. We'll update our references here. then it's very explicit what we're referencing. What setName allows us to do is we can set the name property on our game object, and internally Phaser doesn't actually use this, and we can use it for anything we like. How we're going to use it is when we check for our overlap between our player and one of our event game objects, we need to know which event is associated with that game object. And so by storing our event ID here, once we have that collision, we'll know which event we need to trigger in our game. We'll also use that for cleaning up our objects. And so to clean up our objects later on, we need to store a reference to this on our class. So let's make a new variable. We'll do const and event zone. It's going to be equal to our new game object. Let's make a new property. We're going to do event zones. And this is going to be an object where our key will be our event ID. And then it's going to store a reference to our game object. And then that's how we'll be able to clean it up. Let's come to the top of our class and let's add that new property in. So we'll add in event zones for our type. This is going to be an object. And then the key on our object is going to be a string. And then for our object itself, and then for our value, it's going to be a phaser game objects and then a zone game object. All right, I'm going to come back down to our method, and I'm going to log out our new event zones. We'll do console log, we'll do event zone, we'll save our changes. Before we test, let's open up our preload scene, and we're going to toggle from our title scene right into our world scene so we can quickly test. Oh, and one last change we need to make is we actually need to call our brand new method. So if we come to our create method, let's come down to the very bottom. So right after we create our menu, we're going to do create event zones, and we're going to call our new method. Now if we save, let's come back to our browser. Oh, it looks like we have a bug. Yes, so for our new property that we added, we don't have a default value, so right now it's undefined. So now, of course, we're getting an error. So let's come into our init method. Let's do this. We'll do our event zones, and we're going to set it equal to an empty object. Now if we save, let's come back. We'll see now we have two game objects that were created, and we don't actually see them in our scene. And so if we want to be able to test our zones and see them visually, we need to create another game object to represent them. To do that, we're going to create a rectangle game object, and we're going to show that in our phaser scene. So we'll also want to clean up these game objects. So let's come up to the top of our class. Let's add a new property, keep track of these. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it. But instead of doing a zone, we're going to do a rectangle. And for our property name, let's call this debug event zone objects. Let's add in our default value. So we'll come to our init method. We'll add that in. We'll do an empty object. Now let's come down to the bottom of our class. And after we create our zone game object, let's create our new rectangle game object so we can see our zone. So for this, let's make a new variable. We'll do const. We'll do debug zone rectangle. It's going to be equal to this.add.rectangle. Now for this, we want to copy our properties from our encounter zone. So let's reference. So for this, we want to copy our properties from our event zone. So we'll do our event zone. Let's grab our X, event zone. We'll grab our Y, and we'll do the same thing for our width and height. Now for our fill color, let's do red. So we'll do 0x-ff0000. And we're going to make this a little bit transparent. So we'll do 0.5 for our alpha. And now we just want to call set origin, and we'll set it equal to 0. And now let's store a reference to that on our new property. So we'll do our debug event zone objects, and then we'll set it equal to our new object. So we'll do our debug zone rectangle. All right, so if we save our changes, let's come back to our browser. We'll see now when our game refreshes, we now have these red rectangles that represent our event zones from our map data and tiled. And so by default, we don't want these to be visible to our players, and we only want to see these while we're testing our game. And so to address this, we're just going to wrap these in a feature flag. So if we open up our config file, at the top of our file, let's add a new variable. We'll do export const, and we'll do enable zone debugging. And we're going to set that equal to true for the time being. If we come back to our world scene, for our debug zone here, let's wrap this in an if statement. We'll do if, we'll do enable zone debugging is set to true. Then we want to create our game object here, and let's get rid of our console log. Let's save, come back to our browser. We should still see our red rectangles. And now if we come back, let's go into our config. Let's disable this. So now when our browser refreshes, we'll still have our encounter zones that are not visible, but then for our debugging rectangles, they no longer show up. All right, so let's toggle that back on to true so we can use it while we test. All right, so with that last change, that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to continue working on our encounter zones, and we'll start to add in logic to check for overlaps between our player and our encounter zone game object. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to complete source code for this video, And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see some links on your screen now.